Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Let me just make sure technology-wise we've got it. Okay. One slight correction. While I would have loved to have been honored to have started my professional career as an actual commissioner at the California Energy Commission, I do have to confess that I did not. But we are honored with Jeff Byron is here, who was actually a commissioner at the California Energy Commission, and I had the great honor of working with him when I was a commissioner at the Public Utilities Commission. So I want to thank Sally. I want to thank everybody who has allowed me to come to Stanford. I graduated in human biology 40 years ago, so I'm a testament that you do come back sometimes. But it's a great, great honor. And I'm going to be, this is the first public presentation to talk about this initiative that I'll be taking on over the next 3 years here at Stanford. And just from the turnout, I'm delighted to see the great interest that I have a passion for energy efficiency. I think it's hugely important, and it's very nice to see, you know, so many people coming here to learn more about where we can go ahead with it. My goal today is twofold. One is to tell you a bit about this new initiative, but the second is to invite any of you who are interested in learning more or possibly getting involved to reach out to you, because this is going to be, as I said, a multi-year project. It's going to be involving students, faculty, researchers, and also a larger community in order to really put this framework in place. So, the first thing, what are we talking about in this particular discussion of energy efficiency? It's a subset of energy efficiency, so it's not talking about transportation, even though when we look and think about energy efficiency, transportation is very important. And in fact, the federal CAFE standards have been enormously important in increasing the efficiency of our transportation system. The other part is to keep in mind is that I'm also not going to be addressing agriculture and industrial end uses. Those are very important, particularly agriculture in California, but they have their own set of players and their own issues. And so for this purpose, it's really going to be the residential and commercial building stock, and looking at end uses in those buildings: cooling, heating, lighting, as well as what we call plug-in loads, computers, TVs, that sort of thing. So that's for purposes of the talk today, and also the initiative, it's really the commercial and residential end use in buildings. So this is it. The initiative, I do want to say that this is a work in progress as far as defining the scope and the approach, but based on a lot of different discussions and research to date, here's what we're looking at it. So I'm just going to take a minute to read it out loud because it is awfully long, but it tries to capture the scope of what this is about. It's to develop a new framework to mobilize and deliver non-transportation energy efficiency savings at a level far beyond historical practice for the commercial and residential sectors that provides persistent greenhouse gas emission reductions and optimizes operation of an electric grid with very high levels of intermittent renewable resources, including distributed generation and increasing levels of transportation, electrification, and storage. That's a mouthful. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but I wanted to, from the beginning, help you understand that when we're looking at developing a new framework for energy efficiency, we want to do so in the context of where our electric grid is evolving, where we're going to be dealing with carbon emission reductions, and not have it just be a standalone aspect, which quite frankly it has been for most of the history of how we've used it. So the current focus is CFLs. Over 70% of the programs in the United States are focused on replacing incandescent light bulbs with CFLs. And this is actually a very important thing to do because the incandescent light bulbs are very inefficient. But starting this year in California and next year nationally, incandescent light bulbs, traditional incandescent light bulbs, are actually outlawed. And so the use of this measure is going to very quickly be obsolete. And one of the problems we have is we don't have in our back pocket another widget that looks like a CFL that can just be put in place to then absorb the void that's left of sort of where are we going with this. There are a few other problems with the use of CFLs that have to be kept in mind when we think about moving forward. One is when you're just dealing with the widget, and we found this with CFLs, what you're doing is basically subsidizing the cost of its purchase and sometimes its manufacture. But you're then really hoping that when they are purchased, they actually get installed in buildings. And I'm sure many of you have had the experience of those CFLs that you put in, they just don't look quite right. And we've had many studies that say the actual savings from energy efficiency with CFLs is far less than was forecast, because these studies assume that they would be put in kitchens and places that were used all the time, whereas you have an awful lot of them that were put in closets, in garages, or just simply in a cardboard box. And this again is an example of the gap that we have in the world of energy efficiency between what looks very promising with the technology and understanding what's going on. Another issue that it exemplifies is that it essentially chose a specific technology for lighting, CFLs. And this made a lot of sense because that was really what was developed, 7 or 8 years ago. But in the meantime, as I'm sure many of you know, LEDs are really gaining a lot of traction, and it turns out that they are much more able to be flexible and adapt, and there's a lot of consumer acceptance. And so now the question is driving down the price. And so this is another example in the world of energy efficiency where it becomes very complex between, are you selecting a specific widget that you know can work and getting that out into the marketplace, versus how can you really have a system that supports innovation and new technologies. So the changing role of energy efficiency, this just goes back as a reminder of what I said the goal of the project is. It's to be looking at climate change, how energy efficiency can really play a role. And for that, a factor that's going to be increasingly important is persistency of energy efficiency savings. That buildings are composed of a lot of different systems and people in them and all sorts of things. And so we have in the world of energy efficiency practice that's called retro commissioning or tune-ups, where you go in and basically get that building up to snuff again. There are any number of studies that show within 5 to 7 years you've had very significant degradation in the operation of that building. And so again, thinking about with climate change, we don't have enough time or money to just keep going back into buildings time after time. And for the United States, existing building stock is what counts. In the developing countries, the focus is on the new buildings, but here in the United States, and this project is looking at the existing buildings. And then the other part that's changing is our grid, that in a majority of states now we have renewable portfolio standards that have certain levels of utility scale renewables that are required. And then we have an increasing growth in distributed generation, solar photovoltaics, that are put on the roofs of buildings. And these are all going to be causing the grid to operate with much greater intermittency. So one of the things that we're looking at is how can energy efficiency play a role in basically stabilizing and balancing out the grid. And this is important because energy efficiency is traditionally low cost or no cost. You save money because you're using less energy. And so if we can use energy efficiency in this way to not only help stabilize the grid, it'll help on reliability, but it will also help to keep our electric rates affordable. And that's why thinking about this new role for energy efficiency is so important. So the good news is we do have new tools, and this is just an example of 4 areas. And when I talk about tools, I'm not just talking about hardware, I'm talking about new information and understanding. One is the way that behavior change can be utilized. Many of you probably have heard of O-Power. Nest and with the thermostat is another example of trying to drive behavior change. But even beyond that, we're understanding a lot more about social decision making. And energy efficiency is actually dozens, hundreds, thousands of usually voluntary decisions to make something happen. And so really mobilizing our information in this area is very important. We also have installed here in California, but around the country and around the world, millions of smart meters that are measuring usage on either an hourly or a more often basis. 15 minutes is very traditional as well. And I was reading in preparation for this that we now have about 43 million of these smart meters installed in the United States. And they are generating, if you took a conservative assumption that they were only measuring interval meter once an hour as opposed to every 15 minutes. So this is a conservative assumption. They're generating 1.1 million data points a day. We didn't have anything like that 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So we're seeing a number of companies who are developing the ability through software analytics to take that data and understand what's going on in the building, to measure what happens in the building, and to really be able to think about how we could change the world of energy efficiency. A third area is on the bottom left, and that's building controls and sensors. That we have, again, a proliferation of these controls and sensors being developed, and the cost is coming down. And that's not an area that we've ever really utilized in energy efficiency. So it too offers a lot of promise. And then finally, there's financing and driving investment and getting a better understanding of not just how we create more private financing, but how can we increase the uptake and use of it in the world of energy efficiency. So here's an overview of 3 items I'm going to be covering. 1, why is a new energy framework needed? Second, what we're now looking at developing as the areas of research that we'll be doing over the next few years on this next generation. And third and final is, if you're interested in this area, how you can get involved. I don't know if you've seen this, but this is a sobering chart, and it tells, for me, the story of why we need a new generation. It was published in Science in January 2012, and it was the result of work done by the the company E3, which is mainly Stanford graduates, I'm happy to say, and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And what they did was that they looked at different pathways to getting to greenhouse gas emission reductions in 2050. And the goal for 2050 is sort of the traditional, we want to be down to 20% of our 1990 levels by 2050. And here in California, while it's not in law yet, it is an aspirational goal that many of our policymakers are working towards. And this then the study looked at what would be the different wedges that you would use to get there. And it concluded that in terms of sort of least cost, this is pretty much a trajectory that looks like it makes sense. The actual timing could differ. But the things that I want to call to mind are, first of all, the top blue is the energy efficiency. And if you look at, just try to eyeball 2013, that blue wedge is pretty darn small. And you look out over at 2050, it's basically 2.6 times California's historically delivered savings. California, for now 30 years, has been running the world's most successful energy efficiency program. So think about this. What it means is, for California, with all the successes we have basically to go in a little bit more than 30 years to almost tripling the savings that we have to be achieving. And that's why it is clear that if you just do the same level of efforts and approaches on energy efficiency we have for the last 30 years, while they have been successful, there's no doubt about that, we've got to think of something different if we're going to get to the level of savings that we need by 2050. And that's why I and others have been asked to think about and really develop this new framework. The other thing that I'll point out is the other wedges. And if you look at it, the electricity decarbonization, which I think is deep purple, that is basically saying your electric grid needs to be decarbonized, of which you can do it through renewables, you can do it through nuclear, you can do it through carbon capture and sequestration. For purposes of this study, and pretty much if you're thinking about California, the view is it will be mostly renewables. And the study concluded you would end up with a system, the most it could tolerate is about 75% renewables. It also shows, the red is quite small actually, it's the solar photovoltaics, and then the yellow is electrification of the transportation system. So that's why I've put in, as I've discussed, the goal of this project is not just the carbon emissions, but to think about how energy efficiency can play a role in what's going to be the dramatic increase of the renewables and photovoltaics on our system, as well as think about how energy efficiency and use of energy in a building may be able to interact with the electrification of the transportation system that we're planning on happening. So a few more slides just to give some background. This is a summary of U.S. customer-funded electric energy efficiency budgets. And the customer-funded is that in the world of energy efficiency, most states now have on the electric and natural gas bills of their utilities a small charge that funds energy efficiency programs that are done by the utilities or sometimes a third party in the state. In the world of energy efficiency, you also have mandatory codes and standards, and you may have some efforts at the local government level. But the world of utility administered or third party administered program is huge. So there's good news here, which is that over the last 7 years or so, budgets on the electric side, because that tends to be the largest size, have doubled. I mean, that's good news. We see an increase. But then this was a study that most of the work was done by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And on the far right-hand side, the yellow is the medium case, and then the farthest right is the high case projection. And again, it's good news. It's showing them as increasing. But when you look at the actual numbers, you see that from 2013 to 2025, which is, let's see, 10, 13, 14 years, in the high case, the optimistic case, you're only seeing a doubling. So if you think about it, we had a doubling of these budgets over a 7-year period, and then over the next 14-year period, you're only seeing another doubling. And then keep in mind what I showed you about the wedge of what the savings that we need to achieve are. So what this tells us is that either we need to drastically reduce costs so that we can, with that same number of dollars, get these greater savings. We need to potentially increase what's going to be the public funding through these charges, though politically I think that we can't just rely, having been a regulator, I don't think we can rely on we're just going to increase rates through these charges. We potentially will be doing mandates, so it's just going to be in a law that you have to have these savings, or we may be able to make better use to leverage this public money to then drive greater private investment. I don't know the answer to that, but what I do know is some combination of those fours is going to have to happen, or we're just talking, deep magic to get, with this amount of dollars, the level of savings we have. And I, for one, don't want to rely on that. here's just sort of the chart that lays out the 10 top states and their budgets 2011, and you can see that California just overshadows things. So the good news for you here at Stanford and part of the community, we have a wonderful laboratory in which to try to see how we make this happen, because there already is such a strong commitment. But as I said, when we look ahead, this doesn't begin to get us where we need to go. And then you look at some of the other states, and that's why I think a new framework is going to be so helpful around the country. This is a chart, and I see Jim Sweeney sitting here, that this for many years was called the Rosenfield curve. It was named in honor of Art Rosenfield, who was basically the grandfather of energy efficiency, worked for many years at UC Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and was a fellow commissioner with Jeff Byron. So for many years, this curve didn't include that green line. It just had the pink line and the orange line. And I and many others went around the country, went around the world saying California is a tremendous success, because what the chart does show is that the per capita energy use in California has remained constant, basically constant, for about 30 years. I don't have a pointer, but if you see about 1974, when it started to really go flat, that's when the California Energy Commission was established, and that's when the first round of building standards and appliance standards went into effect. And before that, you were having an increase similar to what was happening nationally. So what we have said that's gotten a tremendous amount of interest is that you can grow the economy of your state while still keeping the per capita use flat. And the very sad tale is what happened in the rest of the United States, where they did continue to have an upward curve. But what Jim Sweeney and his graduate student did in 2008 was they deconstructed this curve. And they really went into the details behind it. And what they discovered is that much of the reason why we're able to have a lower per capita consumption is because we have generally a mild climate. Our building stock tends to be a bit smaller, and we don't have as much industry as other states. And so what has been added to that line, not just in the research that was done here, but actually on the public websites, is the green line. And it is the delta between the green line and the gold line, which is actually what has been the energy savings from energy efficiency in California. It is still very substantial. This is not to belittle these efforts, but it's a word of caution that for energy efficiency, having rigor in analysis, and especially in thinking about results, is incredibly important, because this chart without the deconstruction was in use, I think, for a decade, am I right? And we wish it was true that we didn't have a deconstruction, but it's, you know, we really need to be honest about what's happening in this world of efficiency. This is a chart that is on the Public Utilities Commission website that shows between 2010 and 2012, through the utility programs here in California, the investor-owned utilities, which is about 80% of the load in California, where are the savings coming from? The blue line is lighting. 70% of these savings from lighting, and this is traditional across the state, across the country. And remember what I talked about is that CFLs, and CFLs are no longer going to be a tool we have in hand. So what are we going to do? There is good news. This is a study that was done in 2002, so over a decade ago, and what it looked at was the potential for both technical and economic savings in energy efficiency. And it did conclude that lighting is very important. It's the largest shade for both the residential and the commercial. But it found that there are significant opportunities elsewhere to have energy efficiency savings. But again, one has to ask, well, if we knew about this for over a decade, why do we have that prior chart that has overwhelmingly the line coming from lighting? And that's one of the questions that we're all starting to ponder and think about, which is why I come to the limitations of the current framework. It's building upon a framework that we started 30 years ago when we first started doing energy efficiency that is very widget-based and really is driving towards the least cost, which isn't a bad thing to happen at all because we don't want to be spending money if we can avoid it. But what it does is it leaves us in the situation we are in today when the main tool we've had in the world of energy efficiency, CFLs, are no longer the tool we can use because they're going to come in through basically mandatory standards and requirement. We have a focus on energy efficiency and cost, which again is good. We shouldn't ignore it, but we haven't looked at the sustained reduction of emissions or the evolving grid, and that's why looking forward, that's going to be so important. And we've had limited attention to how the role of private sector financing or spurring on and increasing innovation. And then evaluation, measurement, and verification results are very uneven, they're disputed. Because we don't have a national energy efficiency structure or program, each state basically sets the rules for how it measures energy efficiency savings. And I can say it's, let 50 flowers bloom at least. There are definitely efforts being made to try to make it more consistent, but it is a situation where every state decides what the rules are, and so you can have the same measure done in two different states and get very different reported savings. And then this is delivered through a public policy regulatory framework. Energy is very highly regulated and energy efficiency is highly regulated because it grew out of this idea that we would have subsidies through the electric and natural gas bills and the delivery would go through utilities. That has been successful, but as a result, it's very regulated. It's fragmented on the development, the implementation, the assessment, and the oversight. So that's the stage of where we stand now. A lot of successes, but a lot of problems, and my belief, and I think many, many others, is we're going to have to fundamentally think about changing the framework if we're going to get the results we want, especially if we want to have energy efficiency play such a strong role. So that brings us to our project that we're launching on the next generation of energy efficiency. It's a vision, developing a vision for widespread mobilization and delivery of energy efficiency through 2050. And I take a moment to pause on the words mobilization, because in energy efficiency, creating demand, gathering together the resources so we can make it happen, and then the delivery, which is both the implementation, but then also looking at the persistency of the savings is going to be critical. So I'm going to spend a few minutes now going through the different research areas that we've targeted. This again is in a state of evolution, but these look like the important questions that need to be asked. The first area is just energy efficiency's historical role and results. What's worked and not worked, and we've selected a few parameters up here: carbon emission reductions, persistency of savings, scalability and market share, market transformation. There may be other factors. There are literally hundreds of studies that have come out that have looked at specific programs, have looked at all sorts of things with energy efficiency. But what we don't have and what we really need, I think, is a very solid, comprehensive, understandable look into what has worked and not worked, at least in these particular areas. The next step is going to be looking at the changing role and scope of energy efficiency. And I've talked about it, the idea of carbon emission reductions and therefore the persistency of savings and the changing grid. But also the need to have large-scale participation, as well as having it be energy efficiency that can be delivered somewhat faster, more comprehensive with the persistent savings. And that's a role that, again, is quickly evolving of What do we know? How can we describe that? What do we think that needs to look like? So the third area, which is really the heart of the matter, is looking at the elements that would go into developing a new framework that is climate-driven, that supports new technologies. We cannot get there with these types of savings that we're looking at unless we really bring in new technologies and innovation, and at a far faster pace than what we have been doing. And then optimizing grid operations with a focus on mobilization and delivery. So a threshold question for this area is going to be, what does the commercial and residential building market look like through 2050? What do the end uses look like between now and then? And how can we think about maximizing both savings and value? Because a lot of the tools we use now for cost effectiveness and everything else, they aren't looked at through this new lens. And so thinking about it, researching it, and then starting to develop some methodologies is going to be key. What I also want to do is to look at this through three new key areas, because I'm personally convinced that this is going to be the key, and it certainly builds upon strengths here at Stanford, which is why I think it fits so well. And these three areas, the first is data and analytics. As you recall that I talked about the meters that are coming, that actually in California, we pretty much have them installed throughout the state, but we're seeing them all across the country. And that's generating such a lot of data, and we have some wonderfully insightful ways that we're starting to understand how you can use that data. But we're also, when we talk about data, we're thinking about setting up databases that are publicly accessible, benchmarking of buildings, the advanced controls. So there's a whole area to explore with this new tool, how it can be brought into the framework. The second area is behavior change and social decision making. Again, we've just started to really think about that and introduce just not a few small programs, but very basic programs in this area, and thinking about how this could be used to really drive savings and ensure their persistency is important. And then the final one is driving private sector investment. Profit matters. That one of the statistics we had, the governor had a energy efficiency big think about a year ago, and when they took the numbers of 2050 and looked at our current spend, basically it came out that we need to think about, with a combination of public investment and private investment, on the order of about $10 billion of investment in energy efficiency annually in California alone. $10 billion. And as I said, I don't think that's coming from the government. I think most of it has to come from the private sector. So again, doing the type of research and thinking through not just what are new financing instruments, but understanding how the market can value and use those instruments is going to be very, very important. So we're almost done with the research areas, and there's just two more. The fourth area is thinking about the new regulatory models. That, as I said, this is an area that's very highly regulated, and we can do all the great work that we want on innovation, on technology, on business models, but if we don't think about the regulatory structure, we're not going to get there. And so this is thinking about what would be needed in terms of market information, transparency. How are we linking it to greenhouse gas emission goals? As Sally mentioned, we're going to be talking more this year in this seminar on the EPA's new proposed carbon rules, 111D, but thinking about how our energy efficiency tools are going to work with that is going to be very important. We need to have policies, incentives. We've had this one called decoupling that I won't go into, but it's 30 years old. And we need to have a whole lot more to really have incentives to administrators of programs, to the players in the market, and to think about how they should be structured so that we really are making the best use when we are using public money. And then the final one that I put down is the regulatory agencies themselves. What I've noted in the clean energy world, too often when we talk about reforming the regulatory model, it's thinking about the utility revenue models, which are important and do need to be reformed. But having worked now within two state agencies, we have to think about how to provide them with more tools and somewhat more resources. Here in California, running the largest energy efficiency program at the California Public Utilities Commission, which oversees a $1.5 billion utility program annually, I think at most there's 40 people there. And they have to, do the whole gamut for $1.5 billion. And we have increasingly ways in which it's not just a public utilities commission. You have to reach over to your air quality agency. You may have a state energy office. You've got local governments. And everybody's sort of doing things in a silo. And thinking about thinking about how we can help streamline both information crossing agencies as well as agency decision-making and processes is very important. It typically takes in California from start to finish 2-3 years to actually get in place a decision authorizing energy efficiency funding. And it's very hard because then that locks in place program approvals. And we don't have anything at all here in California or elsewhere in the country that really supports on a continuing basis bringing innovation into the system. So that's one of the areas that is going to be very important to think about. Then the final area is enhanced evaluation, measurement, and verification. And starting with the question of what do we want to measure and why do we want to measure it? Cost effectiveness tests, without going into detail, are a huge part of the role of energy efficiency, and sort of rethinking them and thinking about how they will then play out with EM&B is going to be very important. And then an area that I'm personally very excited about is how we can use some of these new tools. We've got all these meters, they're, on a regular basis, they're checking the energy use in the buildings, and we can use that information to build databases that really help us understand how programs and efforts are performing and provide almost a real-time feedback. The current way that we do things is you run a program, and then when it finishes, whoever is the person, they do an RFP, they hire the consultant that then will go into the building or talk to the people. By then, whoever actually was in charge of the program may have left, and there's papers in whatever form they are to describe it. And we also have this system in California, well, most of the places in the country, that is based on attribution of savings, which says that if I put a CFL in my home, somebody's going to know, did I do it because I got an ad from PG&E or the city of Palo Alto, or did I do it because I just believe in energy efficiency? In California, we're spending over $50 million a year on hiring consultants to do EM&V. Not that we want to put folks out of jobs, but I want them to be more productive, because a lot of this is spent arguing with one another. And this is true everywhere. One person gets hired to produce one study, another to fight that study, and you have this back and forth. And I personally believe if we think about the world we want to be in for energy efficiency in 2020 and beyond, or 2014, what I want to see is that you have a whole lot of forces coming to help people make decisions to be efficient. And it's not just some isolated utility, and it's not just some isolated marketing campaign. And so that this whole idea of attribution becomes nonsensical, that we don't worry about, can we divine out of 10 different influences who was responsible for what, but instead we create a system in which we're encouraging multiple forces to come in to cause action, and we figure out how to incent those different forces. Whereas now in our world, we're actually trying to say, well, let's try and divide this up, and we don't want that integration. So ending observations. I hope I've gotten some folks excited. I hope you understand just this is a very critical area to think about this next generation for climate and for the reliability and affordability of our grid. We're going to be going in very much new and unexplored areas. The solutions, I believe, are going to be complex, holistic, interdisciplinary. If this were easy, it would have been done. And it's going to be a combination of both creative thinking. Frankly, I tend to think some of the best thinking will be people who have never been involved in energy efficiency, but are going to think about system transformation and use of data in other areas that can come help those of us that have been involved for so long. And then rigorous analysis. Again, the Rosenfeld curve deconstructed is really sort of a signpost we want to have that this may be very popular. Everybody may say this is, you know, the one thing you should be doing, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to have a great deal of rigorous analysis. So let me just end with, if you're interested, if you want to be involved, if you just want to follow along, you can get in touch with me or others at the Precourt Energy Efficiency Center. I assume we'll be setting up a web page of some sort. Starting in January, we're going to have regular discussions about this project and the research that's going on that will be open to faculty, staff, researchers here. And then part of the vision is that we're going to involve the larger community outside of Stanford, because to make this work, we have to have significant input and involvement from key stakeholders, the utilities, private companies, investors, local government, policymakers. So to the students, I'm going to say, and faculty, researchers, I think it's going to be very exciting, because it is definitely not an effort that is meant just to sit on a shelf or just to stay within these walls. We've had very strong encouragement from policymakers here in California. I'm starting to talk to policymakers and stakeholders around the country, and there's very, very strong interest. So I guess with that, I'm done, and Sally, you'll take questions or however we want to do it.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, we'll take some questions, and like we always do, we always start off with students. So any students who have questions, don't be intimidated, you're Stanford students. Okay, oh gosh, oh good, okay, Kareem, of course.
This is great, by the way. This is really exciting. I guess my question is, does the framework, or is there a specific aspect of the framework that would look at how the different solutions that you come up with would be coupled in a way with other programs on renewables? Or are you going to look at other programs that are looking at generation from an agnostic perspective? Because you come into a conversation where you say, okay, I'm improving the energy efficiency programs, but I don't want energy efficiency to start competing with renewables. I want them to complement one another and basically accelerate each other. And I want to make sure that the efficiency is substituting fossil fuels, not necessarily competing on market share with renewables.
That's a good point. That issue of competition, I'd say it's probably outside the framework of this exercise, because that gets into procurement and planning. In other words, how a utility or how a state decides what new resources they bring online. Traditionally, the framework has been that a state sets an energy efficiency goal or requirement, and then that is something that has to happen. I am interested in thinking about how this could fit into a clean energy standard. But I guess what I would say is my focus, and so I think the project's focus will be on, we're looking at it to reduce carbon emissions and not to be in competition with other aspects such as renewables that are also going towards those goals.
Okay, another question. Yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Couldn't LEDs be the next thing to replace CFLs? And why is that something you're looking into, or no? Not why not?
In terms of lighting, there is certainly the view that LEDs will replace CFLs, which gets into the whole question of what are we going to do with all the CFLs, But since they don't really last 7 years, we're okay. But if you remember the slide that I had up that had those two circles that said the secret surplus, that lighting was only about half. So you can think of it as we do want to encourage the advanced lighting technologies, which right now look like they're going to be LEDs. But we have to address all those other areas of energy use. And so that's the answer. LEDs, yes, are very important. I personally think they probably will jump over CFLs in terms of really getting widespread usage, but we have to address the other areas, and that's where we just haven't done, the job that we need to be doing. And those are the tougher areas to look at.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
It seems like the incentives are kind of moving away from more of a widget base in a way, as you're saying, they're kind of moving away from CFLs. Where do you see it going towards in the future?
Well, they aren't moving away yet. We still have about 70% of the programs across the country and perhaps the world, are CFL oriented because they're easy to do and they're inexpensive and you get savings. I mean, it's, I think typically what we're looking at is what's called whole building retrofits, which is a way in which when you go into the building, you're not just doing the least cost thing first and then forgetting about stuff, but you're trying to look at the whole building and make it happen. We launched in California a version of that several years ago called Energy Upgrade California that was trying to put in place doing deeper retrofits in homes. And it was set up that you got increasing incentives if you did more measures, and that it was sold as here's overall how much you'll save on your bill, and looking at a variety of things. We actually have not had very good uptake in that approach. And so one of the areas that has to be studied and analyzed is why hasn't that worked? Are we just never going to be able to do this whole building approach? Or is it something about the marketing, something about enlisting the construction community? So that's one question. The other thing I'll say, and this is where, again, I'm very excited, is that we do see a lot of new technologies coming in. And whole building I tend to think of as, it's a lot of different things coming in, but sort of the other way is think about, it's not just LEDs, but what are the most promising new technologies, and how can a framework be set up that those can make it to market and to widespread distribution much faster than what we've done historically?
Okay, we'll go back there. Yeah.
So it's actually a really good follow-up to what you just said, which is at what point, at what level of maturation does technology have to be before it becomes one of these incentivized systems? CFLs were around for a while before they did. LEDs are similar. I mean, there's this level of what degree of maturation is the technology at before the efficiency can really be incentivized and spread further.
That's correct, but there's actually a bigger question as well, which is the primary vehicle that we've used is running things through utility programs where they offer the subsidies. And to any of my good friends at PG&E, I'm not saying that hasn't been very important. I think it will be important going forward. But we want to think about other delivery paths as well. And that's critical because utilities, as supportive of this as they may be, they're just one institution. And you get a bottleneck if they're the framework in which all new technology has to go through to really get some sort of a subsidy or an incentive. We will probably continue to have a fair amount of money, not just in California, but around the country. I think that is able to be public money, ratepayer money, that can help on bringing down the costs. And so to me, the question is, if you have that amount of money, what do we know about the delivery vehicles so that the new technology can get out there? Our current system is that basically utilities are a lot of the conduit for getting technologies out there, and they do pilot tests, which is reasonable, but you have to have a pilot test in one utility and then a pilot test in another utility and a pilot test in another utility, and then if they decide to scale it up, you know, you have to get the results. And then meanwhile, while that's going on, you have to know what the regulatory approval is, because all that money comes through regulators to fund this. And that's why it ends up being a very slow, cumbersome process. And I really do think we could come up with a much more streamlined, accelerated approach.
Okay, we'll open this up to anybody now. And yeah, you, the green shirt back there, you had your first, and then we'll go back to you, and then we're done. Okay, all right.
So built into your focus, you mentioned at the beginning that there's a degradation that occurs 5 to 7 years after a new installation's done.
Well, after a retro commission, building 290.
What are the leading causes of that degradation?
That you have in buildings very complex management systems, you know, for your air, for your, you know, all the different systems. And over time, you know, if one gets replaced, it isn't synchronized necessarily. I was reading that the controls in buildings are worse than controls in our cars, that we've had a constant level of innovation so that, you know, our cars function smoothly with lots of different systems. But buildings, if something breaks down or gets upgraded, it's put in place, but we don't have, in most buildings, a real integrated sensing system to keep things tuned up. I mean, we actually have technology to do that, but getting it in place and having widespread use is the challenge.
Okay, last question.
Okay, real quick. Let's see. So since you're focused on buildings and other folks are doing agriculture, where does water fit, given how much electricity we spend in this state?
Right.
Is that part of what you're doing, or is that somebody else?
When I was a commissioner, I did a fair amount of work on the water energy nexus, and I am personally very interested in it. I am, at least at this stage, actually not trying to take it on. We have some great folks here who are in water who are also interested, so over time we may, you know, link up. But it's a world unto itself. Stanford could do a whole nother project in that area, but I'm probably not going to focus on it directly.
Okay. Yeah, there are some folks at the Woods Institute for the Environment who are launching a water energy initiative. So, okay, well, thank you very much. That was fantastic.
Okay.